In 1891, a Catholic priest in the south of France became unexpectedly and inexplicably rich. His name was Béranger Saunière. He served a mountain village called Rennes-le-Château, a place with fewer than 200 people, and a church that had been falling apart for decades. His salary from the diocese was almost nothing. He had no known inheritance, no wealthy relatives, no obvious source of income beyond his posting. And then, during a routine renovation of the church floor, he found something. Nobody knows exactly what. What we know is that within a few years he was spending money that bore no relationship to anything he should have had. He built a tower he called the Tour Magdala on the edge of the cliff overlooking the valley. He built a villa for himself beside the church. He filled a library. He laid out gardens. He entertained guests from outside the region. He spent for nearly 2 decades steadily on a scale that the diocese eventually could not ignore. They summoned him to explain himself. He refused to go. They suspended him from his duties in 1911. He appealed the suspension. He died in 1917 before the appeal was resolved, and he took whatever he knew to his grave. Inside the church he left behind, at the entrance, there is a stone figure of a demon, not a gargoyle, not abstract decorative stonework, but a specific figure from tradition, a figure called Asmodeus, the guardian of the treasure of the Temple of Solomon. That is not a neutral choice of imagery for the entrance to a consecrated Catholic church. Inside, one of the stations of the cross shows Christ being carried to or from his tomb under a visible night sky, with a moon above the scene. Jewish law forbids burial at night. Someone put that moon there deliberately, and whoever designed the imagery for that church knew the law well enough to know what they were implying. On the altar, there is a depiction of Mary Magdalene in a cave that scholars have identified as the landscape around the village itself. Her fingers are crossed in a specific way that has been associated with hidden knowledge across several esoteric traditions. Next to her is a tomb. From the cross above the tomb grow 2 living shoots, 2 descendants, 2 survivors of a bloodline. The church has been analysed, photographed, argued over, and visited by hundreds of thousands of people for more than 100 years. No explanation for the imagery has been accepted by everyone who has looked at it carefully. No explanation for Saunière's money has been accepted either. The diocese, which investigated him before his suspension, concluded he had been accepting fees for saying masses on behalf of people across France, collecting payments he had not properly declared. This explanation has never fully satisfied the researchers who followed the story, partly because the scale of the spending appears to exceed what that practice alone could have generated, and partly because the timing of the significant money, which seems to have arrived early in the renovation period, correlates uncomfortably with whatever was found beneath the altar stone. Whatever happened in that village in the 1890s has not been resolved. And the organisation that some people believe was behind it, the organisation that some believe arranged the imagery, managed the priest and used Rennes-le-Château as a staging point for a secret it had been guarding since the time of the Crusades, is called the Priory of Sion, the Priory of Sion. Here is what the priory claimed about itself. It was founded in 1099 in Jerusalem during the First Crusade by Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine, who had just taken the city from its Muslim rulers and declined to call himself king on the grounds that no Christian should wear a crown of gold in the city where Christ wore a crown of thorns. It claimed that Godfrey was a descendant of a bloodline that ran directly back through the kings of ancient Israel to Jesus Christ himself. It claimed to have operated in the shadows of European history for nearly 1,000 years, guarding that bloodline and the documentary evidence that proved it existed. It claimed that among its Grand Masters, the men who had led it across those centuries were Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Sandro Botticelli, Victor Hugo, and Claude Debussy. It claimed that the great secret it was protecting was the fact that Jesus Christ did not die on the cross. or if he did, not before he had married Mary Magdalene and fathered children whose descendants had walked through European history ever since. And it claimed that the Vatican had known all of this for 2,000 years, and had spent 2,000 years suppressing it. That is the story. It became one of the most widely distributed and most widely believed alternative histories of the modern era. Tens of millions of people encountered it through a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, published in 1982, and then through one of the best-selling novels ever written, The Da Vinci Code, in 2003. And the story has a second layer underneath it that is, I would argue, more interesting than the myth itself. Because in 1993, a French court put the man who built the documentary foundation of the entire story under oath, and he admitted that he had fabricated it. All of it. This is an investigation into both layers, into what the Priory claimed and why those claims had the specific shape they did, into the medieval history it attached itself to and why that history provided such a perfect surface for the myth to grip, into the priest and his village and the genuinely unresolved mystery of what he found and what he spent and what the imagery in his church was trying to say, into the man who constructed the modern version of the story and what he was actually trying to accomplish, and into the question I keep coming back to, which is not whether the Priory of Sion was real. It is why this story survived, grew, and continued to be believed by millions of people for decades after the man who invented it confessed in court that he invented it. Because what that tells you, if you sit with it, is not a story about gullibility. It is a story about something much older and much harder to resolve than one man's fraud. To understand the claim the Priory made about itself, you have to start in Jerusalem in 1099. The First Crusade had just ended. The city had been taken from its Muslim rulers after a siege of 5 weeks and a final assault that, by the accounts of the Crusaders themselves, produced a massacre so complete that the horses wading through the streets were stained to their knees. Godfrey of Bouillon was the leader most responsible for the campaign's success, and when the question of who would rule Jerusalem arose, he took a position that became famous. He would not be called king. He would accept the title of Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, the protector of the church, not the monarch of the city. Whether this was genuine humility or carefully staged theatre, historians have been arguing about it for centuries and have not agreed. According to the documents that the Priory later produced as evidence of its history, Godfrey was already the carrier of something more important than a military title. He was, the documents claimed, a direct descendant of the Merovingian dynasty of France, the so-called long-haired kings who had ruled the Frankish kingdom from roughly the 5th century to the 8th century, and who had been deposed in 751 when the Carolingian nobles, with the blessing of the Pope, packed the last Merovingian king off to a monastery with his hair cut, and the Merovingians, in the Priory's telling, were themselves descendants of Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene, through a lineage that had survived in secrecy since the 1st century, carried through the generations by families who knew what they carried and guarded it accordingly. The Merovingians are genuinely strange as medieval dynasties go, and the strangeness is not invented by the Priory. It is in the actual historical record. They were called the long-haired kings because Frankish tradition held that a Merovingian king's power resided literally in his hair, like Samson in the Old Testament, and cutting it was understood as a form of ritual emasculation, a removal of royal authority. They were believed to possess healing powers in the touch of their hands. Tumours could be cured, it was said, by contact with a Merovingian king. They claimed descent in their own mythology from a creature that was half man and half sea beast. They converted to Christianity but retained what appears to have been a distinctly unorthodox religious character even after conversion. Their names, Clovis, Dagobert, Chilperic, Childeric, have the feel of a dynasty that came from somewhere considerably older than Rome and knew it. Their removal from power in 751 was a joint operation between the Church and the Carolingian aristocracy, specifically Pepin the Short, whose son Charlemagne would become the most celebrated Christian emperor of the medieval West. The Church's role in deposing the Merovingians and replacing them with a dynasty that owed its legitimacy partly to papal sanction is historically documented. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is what happened, and the historical record is clear about it. This gives the Priory story's claim of ongoing Vatican hostility to the bloodline a narrative coherence that does not require any additional fabrication to support it. The Vatican did help remove the Merovingians. Whether it did so because it feared a sacred bloodline is a different question entirely. But the shape of the history fits the shape of the claim, which is a very considerable asset for any mythology that wants to attach itself to the documented record. The Priory documents claimed that the bloodline survived the deposition, that there were Merovingian relatives who went underground, protected by a network of sympathetic nobles and churchmen, passing what they carried through the generations in secrecy. And the Priory of Sion was the organisation that had maintained this protection from 1099, when it was formally established in Jerusalem, to the present. Moving through centuries of European history, recruiting from the highest levels of intellectual and artistic life, embedding itself in Masonic lodges and noble courts and cathedral chapters, always visible enough to sustain itself, never visible enough to be directly attacked. The military organisation it is said to have used as its external arm was the Knights Templar. The Templars were founded in Jerusalem around 1119, officially to protect Christian pilgrims on the roads to the holy sites. They grew into something considerably larger than that. They became bankers to kings across Europe. They built a financial network that stretched from England to the Levant. They developed their own architectural tradition, their own internal legal status, their own hierarchy of grades, and a level of accumulated wealth and political independence that made secular rulers increasingly uncomfortable. In October 1307, King Philip IV of France, who owed the Templars an enormous amount of money, coordinated with Pope Clement V to arrest every Templar in France simultaneously, on a single morning, before any of them could organise any kind of response. The charges brought against them were heresy, sodomy, and the worship of an idol called Baphomet, a bearded head or a goat figure whose description varied from prisoner to prisoner in ways that strongly suggest the confessions were coerced rather than factual. The last Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in Paris in 1314 after retracting a confession he'd given under torture. He reportedly cursed both the king and the pope from the flames and predicted their deaths within a year. Philip IV died 7 months later. Clement V was dead within a month of Philip. Whether that was prophecy, meaningful coincidence, or history tidied up by later storytellers is not a question anyone can answer at 700 years remove. What can be said is that the Templars' suppression left behind a mythology of hidden knowledge, of treasure that was never recovered, of secret wisdom transmitted through channels the Inquisitors never found. The Priory documents position themselves as the explanation for all of that. The Templars were the brawn. The Priory was the brains. The Templars could be arrested and burned. The Priory, operating at the level of ideas and genealogy, rather than military force, could not be touched. When the Templars fell, the knowledge survived. The bloodline survived. And then, in the 19th century, a priest in a mountain village in the south of France started spending money he had no right to have, and decorated his church with imagery that seemed, to those who looked carefully enough, to be pointing directly at the secret the Priory was still carrying. Before we get to Saunière and his money in more detail, it is worth understanding why the south of France specifically was chosen as the setting for this mythology, because it was not an arbitrary choice. The region around Rennes-le-Château, the Languedoc, had a religious history that made it uniquely suited to carry a story like this. The veneration of Mary Magdalene in southern France is centuries old and runs considerably deeper than anything the official church was entirely comfortable with. There is a cave outside a village called Saint-Baume, where local tradition, maintained for at least 1,000 years, holds that Magdalene spent the last 30 years of her life in solitary contemplation after coming to France from the Holy Land. There are churches dedicated to her throughout the region, in numbers that do not reflect her relatively minor role in the official canonical Gospels. The tradition that she came to France at all, possibly accompanied by Joseph of Arimathea, possibly pregnant, is old enough and locally embedded enough that it cannot simply be explained away as a modern invention attached to the Priory story. It predates Pierre Plantard by many centuries. Whatever historical kernel, if any, it reflects, the tradition itself is real and documented. This same region was the heartland of the Cathar heresy in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Cathars were a Christian movement that the institutional church regarded as so threatening that Pope Innocent III launched a military crusade against them on French soil in 1209, the Albigensian Crusade, which killed somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people, depending on which historian you consult. The Cathars believed, among other things, that the material world was the creation of an evil god and not the good God of the New Testament. They believed that the Christ of the official church, the one who suffered in a physical body and died on the cross, was not the real Christ at all. Their extermination was thorough. The last major Cathar stronghold, the mountain fortress of Montségur, fell in 1244 after a 10-month siege. More than 200 Cathars who refused to recant were burned at the base of the mountain on a single day. The local memory of that event has not faded in almost 800 years. You can still visit Montségur. The mountain still stands above the Languedoc plain, and the people of the region still know what happened there. What this means for the Priory story is that the south of France, and specifically the area around Rennes-le-Château, was a landscape already saturated with the memory of suppressed Christian traditions, of alternative versions of the Christ story, of institutions that had been destroyed because what they knew or believed was incompatible with what Rome was prepared to tolerate. When the Priory mythology arrived and claimed that the region contained buried evidence of a Jesus who had not died on the cross and who had founded a bloodline that Rome had spent centuries trying to extinguish, it was not landing in neutral territory. It was landing in a place where people had been burned alive for believing something not entirely different, and where that memory was still alive in the local consciousness. The myth did not have to create its own atmosphere. The atmosphere was already there, centuries deep. The claim about Mary Magdalene specifically is worth examining in some detail, because it is not simply an invention of the 1960s. Serious biblical scholars, working from legitimate sources, have raised questions about her role and her relationship to Jesus that do not depend on anything Pierre Plantard ever wrote. The Gospel of Mary, one of the Gnostic texts that was not included in the canonical New Testament, presents Magdalene as a figure of significant spiritual authority, someone to whom Christ gave private teachings that he did not give to the male disciples. The Gospel of Philip, another Gnostic text, contains a passage describing Christ kissing Magdalene, though the precise word used in the damaged original is not entirely recoverable and has been variously interpreted. These texts are not forgeries. They're genuine ancient documents discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, 17 centuries old, written in Coptic and translated by legitimate scholars. They did not appear in the canonical Bible, not because they were false in some absolute sense, but because they reflected streams of early Christian belief that the Church's leadership decided, in the process of establishing orthodoxy, were not going to be included in the official record. The canonical Gospels themselves contain details about Magdalene that have always required explanation. She's the first person to whom Christ reveals himself after the resurrection, according to 3 of the 4 Gospels. She was present at the crucifixion. She was one of the women who went to the tomb. In Jewish culture of the 1st century, an unmarried man of 30 travelling with a mixed group of men and women was unusual, though not impossible. The fact that the Gospels never explicitly mention whether Jesus was married or unmarried is itself something that scholars have debated, because for a Jewish man of that period and that class, celibacy was unusual enough that it would typically have been noted or explained. None of this proves the Priory's claims. All of it means that the questions the Priory story was built around are not entirely invented. They are real historical questions that biblical scholarship has engaged with on its own terms, independently of any secret society and any forged document. That is the architecture of the myth. And I want to be direct with you about something. It is an impressively constructed architecture. It uses real history. It attaches itself to genuine mysteries, the Merovingians' peculiarities, the Templars' unsolved suppression, Saunier's unexplained wealth. All of these are real, documented, unresolved things. The Priory story provided a single framework that explained all of them simultaneously. This is what effective mythology does. It does not invent the landscape it inhabits. It finds a landscape that already contains enough irregularity, enough unexplained corners, enough documented coincidence, and it moves in and makes itself at home. The claims were precisely calibrated to attach to real historical ambiguities in ways that could not be easily disproven, because the underlying mysteries they were attaching to could not be easily resolved. The church at Rennes-le-Château deserves more attention than a passing mention, because the imagery Saunier left behind in it is genuinely strange enough that it has been analysed by people with no interest in secret societies whatsoever and still generated puzzlement. The stone figure of Asmodeus at the entrance is the most immediately striking element, but it is not the only one. The holy water stoop that the demon supports is also unusual. On either side of it there are salamanders, creatures that in alchemical tradition are associated with fire and with the transformation of base material into something higher. Above the entrance inside is the Latin inscription that Saunier had placed there, which translates roughly as "This place is terrible. It is the house of God and the gate of heaven." The phrase comes from the book of Genesis and refers to the site where Jacob dreamed of a ladder connecting earth and heaven. It is an unusual choice for a village church in southern France, and the word terrible in its original Latin carries connotations of the sacred and the awe-inspiring rather than the frightening. But it is still not a phrase that a conventional Catholic priest decorating a conventional Catholic church would typically reach for. Inside, the floor pattern that Saunier installed features a distinctive checkerboard of black and white tiles, a pattern that has been associated with Masonic symbolism since at least the 18th century, where it represents the duality of light and shadow, sacred and profane, initiate and outsider. The Stations of the Cross on the walls, commissioned by Saunier, contain, in addition to the nocturnal burial scene, a number of other details that researchers have found unusual. One station contains a figure in Scottish Highland dress that has never been satisfactorily explained in terms of conventional Catholic iconography. Another contains a child wrapped in what appears to be a shroud, being carried by a figure in darkness. The cumulative effect of all of this imagery is not subtle. It is a church that someone, whether Saunier acting alone or Saunier acting with guidance, filled with symbolism drawn from multiple traditions simultaneously, not all of them conventionally Catholic, and arranged it in a pattern that feels deliberate rather than eclectic. Art historians who have looked at Saunier's church without any prior commitment to either the Priory mythology or its debunking have generally concluded that the imagery is unusual, but not impossible to explain within the late 19th century Catholic tradition of the region, particularly in an area with a strong Magdalene cult and a regional memory of heterodox Christianity going back to the Cathars. That is probably the most professionally defensible position available to them. It leaves open the question of what Saunier specifically intended, because intention is not something that can be read off imagery alone without additional documentation, and Saunier left almost none. He destroyed much of his correspondence. He refused to explain himself to his superiors. He maintained his silence to the end and beyond it. Now to the documents themselves, because the Priory did not only make verbal claims, it produced what it presented as evidence. In 1964, a set of documents appeared in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library of France in Paris. They were called the Dossiers Secrets, the secret files. They had been deposited under false names, placed in the archives collection by persons unknown, and subsequently discovered by researchers working their way through unpublished manuscripts in the collection. The method of discovery is important and worth thinking about carefully. Documents that someone hands you are documents someone wants you to have. Documents you find yourself buried in a national archive feel like truth. They feel like something the official record had not intended you to see. That feeling is itself a powerful form of persuasion. The dossier secrets contained genealogies, charters, and what appeared to be historical records supporting the Priory's account of itself, and they contained the list of Grand Masters, Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Sandro Botticelli, Nicolas Flamel, René Descartes, Victor Hugo, Claude Debussy, Jean Cocteau. When I went through this material while putting this video together, that list stopped me for a while, because it is not a random list. It is not assembled from whoever happened to be famous enough that the name would look impressive. Look at what the figures on that list actually share, beyond their public reputations. Newton spent more time in his life on alchemy and biblical prophecy than on physics, a fact that embarrassed his later admirers for 2 centuries, and has only been fully acknowledged in recent decades. Leonardo's notebooks contain hermetic and philosophical imagery that scholars of esoteric tradition have been analysing for 500 years. Botticelli worked in the orbit of the Medici court in Florence, which was the centre of Neoplatonic and Hermetic philosophy in the 15th century, and his paintings of classical mythology are saturated with that philosophy in ways that are not superficial decoration. Victor Hugo was a documented Freemason with serious interests in esoteric traditions. Debussy's musical circle in Paris overlapped substantially with the French symbolist movement, which drew heavily on occultist and hermetic ideas. Nicolas Flamel was a 14th century Parisian scribe who, according to tradition, discovered the philosopher's stone, an alchemical claim that placed him at the centre of Hermetic mythology for centuries. Whoever assembled that list knew this about these figures. They were not simply picking famous names. They were picking figures who shared a specific intellectual life that was not widely known to the general public at the time the documents were compiled. That is either genuine insider knowledge about a real tradition, or it is the work of someone who has deeply and seriously read in the history of Western esotericism and used that knowledge to construct something that would withstand scrutiny from exactly the kind of researchers who eventually examined it. Both possibilities are interesting. Only one of them is alarming. The researchers who found the dossier secrets spent years working through them. 3 of them, Michael Bagent, Richard Lee, and Henry Lincoln, published their conclusions in 1982 in a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It became a bestseller immediately and generated substantial controversy. Professional historians attacked its methodology and rejected its conclusions, often quite forcefully. They pointed out that the genealogies in the dossier secrets contained anachronisms. They pointed out that several of the historical claims made in the book could not be corroborated from any independent source. They pointed out that the entire edifice of evidence rested on documents whose provenance was unknown and whose authenticity had not been established by independent examination. These were fair criticisms and, in retrospect, correct ones. But they had a limited effect on the book's audience because the book's audience was not primarily reading it as a work of academic history. They were reading it as a challenge to a version of the past they had been handed by institutions they were already inclined not to fully trust. The 1980s were a particular cultural moment in the Western world. The 1970s had included Watergate, the exposure of CIA domestic surveillance operations, the Church Committee hearings in the United States Senate that documented in exhaustive detail the extent to which American intelligence services had engaged in assassinations, coups, and systematic domestic spying. The institutional church was not yet facing the full scale of its own abuse crisis, but that crisis was already happening, and stories were beginning to surface at the edges. The feminist movement had spent the previous decade making the historical suppression of women's voices and women's stories a subject of mainstream discussion in a way it had never been before. Into this climate came Holy Grail, with its central argument that the most powerful religious institution in Western history had concealed, for 2 millennia, the fact that its founder had been married to a woman who had borne his children, and that it had done so deliberately, systematically, and with considerable violence against anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The argument was not asking its readers to believe something that felt alien to their experience of institutions. It was asking them to believe that an institution was doing, on a grand historical scale, the same thing that they had watched institutions do on smaller scales throughout their adult lives. The reception it got was, in that context, entirely predictable. In 2003, Dan Brown published The Da Vinci Code. He drew heavily on Holy Grail, though he presented the book as fiction. The novel opens with a page titled Fact that states, among other things, that the Priory of Sion is a real organization. It sold somewhere between 80 and 100 million copies worldwide. It was translated into more than 40 languages. A film adaptation reached tens of millions more people who had not read the book. The church at Rennes-le-Château drew more visitors in the decade after publication than it had in the entire preceding century. A piece of alternative history that had been circulating among a specialized audience of researchers for 2 decades became, through the mechanism of mainstream commercial fiction, a piece of shared global culture. And through all of this, the man who had actually built the documentary foundation of the entire story was alive in Paris, watching it happen. Pierre Plantard was born in Paris in 1920. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already established the defining pattern of his life, a deep and consuming need to belong to something historically significant, combined with a complete willingness to manufacture that significance when it could not be found through legitimate means. In 1941, during the Nazi occupation of France, the 21-year-old Plantard wrote to Marshal Pétain, the head of the collaborationist Vichy government, proposing an organization that would, among other things, remove Jews and Freemasons from French society. Pétain's office did not respond with enthusiasm. Plantard later denied having written the letter. The letter exists in French archives. In 1956, Plantard and 3 associates registered an organization with the French authorities under the law governing voluntary associations. The name of the organization was the Priory of Sion. Its stated purpose was to lobby for affordable housing in the town of Annemasse on the Swiss border. There is no mention in the registration documents of sacred bloodlines, crusading knights, Leonardo da Vinci, or anything else that the mythology requires. The Priory of Sion, as Pierre Plantard legally created it, was a housing advocacy group with a handful of members and no historical significance of any kind. Then, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Plantard began building something different. He had an accomplice, a French artist and actor named Philippe de Cherizet, who had considerable skill at producing documents that looked convincingly old. Together, over the course of several years, they created the dossier secrets. They created the genealogies. They fabricated the historical charters. They produced the coded parchments that appeared to be of medieval origin, and they deposited them in the Bibliothèque Nationale under false identities, where they sat in the archives collection until researchers working independently found them and began treating them as genuine historical evidence. De Cherisy later confirmed all of this in a document he left, with instructions that it be published after his death. He described how he had taken text from an old reference book, modified it, added coded messages, and produced what appeared to be medieval documents. He described how Plantard had asked him not to reveal this during Plantard's lifetime. He seems to have been, by the time he wrote the document, genuinely ambivalent about what they had done together. The thing had grown so far beyond what either of them had planned that ambivalence was probably the only honest response available to him. What was Plantard actually trying to accomplish? The answer is specific, and once you see it clearly, it is surprisingly coherent as a plan, even if completely delusional as an ambition. He wanted to be recognised as the rightful king of France. Not metaphorically. He wanted the genealogical documents to establish that he was a Merovingian descendant through a continuous, unbroken, documented lineage, which would mean that the Carolingian deposition of the last Merovingian in 751 had not ended the royal line but merely driven it underground, and that the underground line had now produced its heir in the person of Pierre Plantard of Paris, housing advocate and convicted fraudster. He had been convicted of fraud before the Priory project. The conviction is in the French court records. He had a documented history, going back into the 1940s, of creating organisations claiming large memberships that did not exist, and presenting himself as the leader of something important. The Priory was the most elaborate and ultimately the most successful version of this pattern, though success in this context requires some precision about what was being successfully accomplished. The plan worked better than it had any right to. Researchers found the planted documents and treated them as genuine. Holy blood. Holy Grail gave the myth a mainstream audience, and through this process, Plantard was available. He gave carefully calibrated interviews. He appeared distinguished and faintly mysterious. He confirmed just enough and denied just enough to keep the story alive, without ever committing to a specific claim that could be checked and definitively shown to be false. When a BBC researcher named Henry Lincoln interviewed him in Paris in the 1970s, Plantard wore a fine suit and spoke about the Priory with the measured confidence of a man who knew considerably more than he was saying. When Lincoln pressed him on the nature of the treasure at Rennes-le-Château, Plantard's answer was that the mystery was not in Rennes-le-Château, it was around it. That is the kind of answer a man gives when he has nothing specific to say, but needs to sound as though he could say it if he chose. It is also, I want to note, an almost perfect answer for keeping an interviewer interested without giving them anything they can fact-check. In 1960, 4 years before the dossier secrets were officially found in the Bibliothèque Nationale, the French artist Jean Cocteau, whose name appears on the Grand Master's list, painted a mural in a church in London's West End called Notre Dame de France. The mural depicts the crucifixion. At the foot of the cross there is a figure visible from the knees down, watching the scene rather than suffering in it. The figure is bearded. He carries a fish, one of the earlier symbols of Christian identity in the ancient world. The implication drawn by those who take it seriously is that this is Christ himself, standing alive at the foot of the cross while someone else hangs from it in his place. Cocteau had documented interest in esoteric philosophy. He was a Parisian figure and Plantard was a Parisian operator with a demonstrated gift for cultivating relationships with people whose names carried cultural weight. Whether they knew each other directly, whether the mural is a deliberate encoded statement or simply an unusual artistic choice by a man who enjoyed unusual choices, cannot be established from the surviving evidence. But the timeline sits uncomfortably regardless of which explanation you prefer. The mural was painted before the documents were officially discovered. The name was on the list before the list was supposed to have been found. The end came in 1993, not through historical research but through a French court. A judge named Thierry Jean-Pierre was investigating a financier named Roger Patrice Pellard, a close friend of President François Mitterrand, in connection with an insider trading scandal. Plantard, with the overreach that had characterized his entire career, had allowed his name to appear in documents connected to the investigation. The judge subpoenaed him. Plantard appeared in court. He was put under oath. And under oath, in a French courtroom in 1993, Pierre Plantard admitted that the dossier secrets were forgeries. He admitted that he had fabricated the documents. He admitted that the Priory of Sion, as a medieval organization with a continuous history stretching back to the Crusades, had never existed. He was not charged with anything related to the forgeries themselves. The court's interest was in the financial scandal, not in medieval genealogies. But the admission was in the record, under oath, in a French court in 1993. Plantard died in 2000. He spent the last years of his life largely in silence. He never sat down with the researchers whose careers he had shaped and said, "I built this. Here is how I did it. I am sorry." He simply went quiet in the way a man goes quiet when the story he built has gotten away from him, in ways he can no longer manage, and when the moves he has left are fewer than the ones he has already played. The Da Vinci Code was published 3 years after his death and sold 100 million copies. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves attention before we reach any conclusions, and it is the dimension that I personally find the most revealing. After the Plantard confession in 1993, and after the publication of the research that definitively traced the fabrication to Plantard and de heresy, there were people who continued to claim membership in or knowledge of the Priory of Sion. Not one or two fringe figures, but a small but persistent network of individuals in France and elsewhere who continued to give interviews, continued to confirm the order's existence, continued to speak about its purpose and its membership, with the careful vagueness that the Priory story had always required. One of them was a French artist named Gino Sandri, who had worked as Pierre Plantard's personal secretary for a period, and who described himself after Plantard's death as having served as General Secretary of the Priory with responsibility for public relations and external communications. In interviews given in the years after Plantard's death, Sandri spoke about the Priory's purpose, about the treasure at Rennes-le-Château, about the layers of hidden historical information that the Order was still working to reveal at the right moment. He was careful. He confirmed nothing specific. He denied nothing specific. He maintained the specific quality of deliberate vagueness that the Priory story had always used as its primary defensive mechanism. When pressed on concrete claims, he retreated to generalities about the evolution of man, about circuits of revelation, about information that could only be released when society was ready to receive it. Others appeared in documentaries and interviews claiming to be spokesmen, unofficial representatives, or simply well-informed independent researchers who had been given access to information about the Order's current activities. None of them produced new evidence. None of them made claims that could be checked. All of them maintained the posture of knowing considerably more than they were saying, which is the one posture that the Priory mythology had always depended on, because it is the posture that cannot be disproven. You cannot demonstrate that someone does not know more than they are saying. You can only note that they are not saying it. What these individuals were doing, whatever their private beliefs about it, was maintaining the social reality of the myth after the documentary basis for it had been exposed. This is not an unusual phenomenon. Myths that have found sufficient numbers of genuine believers tend to develop a self-sustaining quality that makes them resistant to the kind of exposure that logically should kill them. The believers become the evidence. The continuation of the belief becomes proof that there must be something to believe. And anyone who points to the court record, to the fabricated documents, to the convicted fraudster who admitted under oath that he invented the whole thing, is reframed within the myth itself as someone who either does not understand the true depth of the story or who is actively participating in the suppression that the myth is built around. You're either a believer, an ignorant person, or an agent of the cover-up. There is no fourth option available within the logic of the system. It is, once you understand how it works, almost perfectly closed. The Da Vinci Code accelerated this dynamic by several orders of magnitude. Dan Brown gave the story a new generation of readers who had not been following the Plantard revelations of the 1990s and who encountered the Priory mythology in its most compelling and most polished fictional form, stripped of all the awkward historical details that complicated the real story, and structured as a thriller in which the myth was not only true, but actively dangerous, with people being killed to prevent its revelation. That is a very effective narrative mechanism. It transformed the myth from a historical claim that could be examined and debunked into an emotional experience that could be felt and shared. And emotional experiences are considerably harder to debunk than historical claims, because the tools for debunking historical claims, documentary evidence, source criticism, cross-referencing with independent records, do not touch the emotional experience at all. The person who has felt the thrill of believing that a 2,000-year-old secret is hidden in a painting by Leonardo da Vinci is not meaningfully reached by being told that a French court determined in 1993 that the documents supporting that claim were forged by a man named Pierre Plantard. The instinct, when you learn about the Plantard admission, is to close the file. He confessed. The documents are forgeries. The story is false. Case closed. And if the question is whether Pierre Plantard's specific documents are genuine historical artifacts, then yes, that is a closed question. He made them up. But there is a set of questions underneath that one that the confession does not touch. It does not tell us what Saunière found in that church floor in 1891, or where his money actually came from. It does not tell us whether the imagery in the church was designed to carry a specific message and what that message was. It does not settle the historical relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, which is a question that legitimate biblical scholars continue to engage with entirely independently of anything the Priory story ever claimed. The Gnostic Gospels, discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, contain passages in which Mary Magdalene occupies a position of authority among the disciples that the canonical Gospels do not give her. The Gospel of Philip contains a passage that has been interpreted as describing a close physical relationship between Jesus and Magdalene. These are real documents. They predate Pierre Plantard by 1700 years. The questions they raise have nothing to do with him, and the confession does not explain why whoever assembled the dossier secrets had detailed insider knowledge of the esoteric intellectual histories of the figures named as Grand Masters, knowledge that was not in any standard popular source at the time the documents were compiled. Plantard admitted that he built the forgeries. He did not fully account for where all of his knowledge came from. The confession establishes the conclusion. It does not entirely explain the mechanism. There is also the matter of Rennes-le-Château itself, which exists as a genuine historical puzzle, entirely independently of anything Pierre Plantard ever claimed. Noël Corbu, the man who bought Saunière's estate after the priest's death and turned it into a hotel in the 1950s, is believed by many historians to have significantly embellished and possibly partly invented the treasure story to attract tourists to what was otherwise a completely unremarkable and extremely remote mountain village. But even if Corbu invented or exaggerated elements of the story, he did not invent Saunier's tower, or his villa, or his library, or his gardens, or the 2 decades of spending that preceded all of it. Those things are documented. The diocese's investigation is documented. Saunier's refusal to explain himself is documented. The spending happened. What caused it has not been established by any investigation to general satisfaction in more than a century of trying. A man who serves a dying village parish with an almost negligible income does not build a personal library and a tower and a villa on what he earns from saying masses for people at a distance, however many of them he was serving. Something else was happening, whatever it was, it remains unknown. The question of what Plantard personally got from 40 years of this is worth sitting with. Not money, not political power. He never came anywhere near recognition as France's rightful king. What he got was, for a person of his particular psychological makeup, probably the only thing that mattered to him. He was important. He was the man at the centre of a secret. He was the keeper of something nobody else could access. He was, within the story he had built around himself, the most significant living figure in European history, the living link in a chain that ran from the present back through Da Vinci and Newton, to Godfrey of Bouillon, to Christ himself. He lived for 4 decades as a man who knew what nobody else knew. For someone constituted the way Plantard appears to have been constituted, that experience may have been sufficient justification for everything else. And if you understand that, you understand something about why secret societies have always attracted members. The hunger that drove Plantard is not unique to him. The desire to be among those who know, the desire for a hidden order behind the visible one, an order you are privileged enough to be part of. The desire for history to be more meaningful than the record suggests, and for that meaning to be available to you specifically. These are consistent features of human psychology across every culture and every century. Secret societies serve that desire. They have always served it. And the fact that a specific society's documents turn out to be forged does not make the desire go away. It just means the next version of the story will need to be more careful about its paper trail. What the Da Vinci Code did in 2003 was take a myth that had been circulating among a relatively specialized audience of researchers and enthusiasts for 2 decades and give it the kind of distribution that only mainstream commercial fiction can provide. 100 million copies sold, 40+ languages, a major film adaptation, the story of the Priory of Sion, of Mary Magdalene, of the sacred bloodline and 2,000 years of Vatican concealment became a piece of shared global culture in a way that no documentary, no academic study, no work of alternative history could have achieved. And once a story reaches that scale of distribution, it acquires its own gravity. It pulls other things toward it. It becomes the reference point. It becomes, for the people who believe it, simply part of what they know about the world, in the same casual and unexamined way they know other things about history they have never personally researched. I have thought about this a great deal while putting this video together, and I've come to think that the most interesting question about the Priory of Sion is not whether it existed. We know that in the form Plantard gave it, it did not. The most interesting question is why a fabricated secret society became more durable, more widely believed, and more culturally influential than most real ones. Why did this particular myth land so hard and prove so difficult to dislodge? Part of the answer is structural. The myth was built around genuine historical mysteries that had not been resolved, and it provided a single coherent explanation for all of them simultaneously. Saunier's money, the Merovingians' fall from power, the Templars' suppression, and their lost treasure. The tradition of Mary Magdalene veneration in southern France that is centuries older than anything the Priory documents claimed and remains genuinely unaccounted for by official church history. When one framework explains a large number of genuinely unresolved things, it is psychologically very difficult to resist, even when you know intellectually that elegance of explanation is not the same thing as evidence of truth. Part of the answer is timing. Holy blood. Holy Grail landed in 1982, in a decade when trust in official institutions in the Western world was at a historic low. Watergate had demonstrated that the American government lied systematically and at the highest level. Church abuse scandals were beginning to surface in ways that made people question what else the institutional church might be concealing. The feminist movement had placed in mainstream discourse a serious examination of how patriarchal institutions had suppressed and distorted women's stories across the whole of recorded history. Into this climate came a book arguing that the most powerful institution in Western civilization had concealed its founder's marriage, his children, and the survival of his bloodline for 2,000 years. The argument found an audience that was already primed by 2 decades of institutional betrayal to believe that this kind of concealment was not only possible but normal and expected. The Da Vinci Code amplified all of this in 2003, when distrust of institutions had reached another peak following the Iraq War and the documented government deceptions that accompanied it. The content of the novel matched the anxieties of the moment with a precision that felt less like coincidence and more like good market research. The Vatican as the great concealer of truth, the bloodline as the suppressed feminine principle in a patriarchal religious tradition, the independent investigator uncovering what the powerful have spent centuries hiding. These are not accidental story elements. They're a story built precisely for the audience it was going to find. And yet none of this entirely explains the persistence. Because myths built on cultural anxiety tend to shift when the anxiety shifts, to take on new forms, to fade from specific claims into general background assumptions. The Priory myth has not done that. It is still there, still circulating, still generating books and arguments and visitors to a small village in the French mountains. Something in the core of it has proven more durable than any specific cultural moment that gave it its audience. What I think has proven durable is not the specific claim about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It is the underlying proposition that the official history is a placeholder for a real history, and that the real history, the one that actually explains why things are the way they are, is being actively guarded by people who have decided you should not know it. That proposition is not false as a general claim about how power works in human societies. Powerful institutions do conceal inconvenient truths. Official histories are written by the people who won. Things that threaten existing power structures get suppressed. These are documented patterns, not theories. The Priory story plugged a fictional specific into a real general pattern, and the real general pattern has kept the fictional specific alive long after the specific was exposed. There is a demon at the entrance to the church in Rennes-le-Château. He has been standing there for more than 130 years. Saunier placed him there, or had him placed, and then died without explaining why. The church around him contains imagery that still has not been fully and satisfactorily explained by anyone, in either the orthodox tradition or the alternative one. No account of what Saunier found and what he spent and what he meant by the choices he made in that building has achieved general acceptance in the centuries since his death. The village around the church attracts visitors every year who have read a novel built on documents fabricated by a man who confessed to fabricating them in a French court in 1993. All of it is connected. None of it is fully resolved. Pierre Plantard built his myth on a genuine mystery. He confessed to the fabrication. He didn't confess to knowing what the mystery underneath it actually was. The mystery was there before him, and it is still there after him. The fabrication was identified. The fabricator confessed. The thing underneath the fabrication remains exactly as unresolved as it was before anyone had heard the name Pierre Plantard. I want to know what you think about this one, specifically this question, because I think it goes beyond the Priory story and touches something much broader about how we understand the past and who we trust to tell it to us. Is a story more powerful when it is true, or when enough people believe it is true? Because what happened with the Priory of Sion is not an isolated case, it is a pattern. Political myths, religious founding stories, the biographies of historical figures slowly remade by those who come after them into something that serves the present more than it reflects the past. The specific details always change. The underlying structure does not. Someone plants a story. The story grows beyond its planter. The story outlasts the planting. The planter dies, and the story keeps going. Plantard spent 40 years building something on nothing. It has outlasted him by more than 2 decades, and shows no particular sign of stopping. The demon at the entrance to a church in the south of France keeps grinning. He has watched a lot of people walk through that door looking for the answer. None of them have come back with it yet.